Having said that, on behalf of my colleagues and myself, we thank you, and we open now the floor for Q&A, and I ask Lisa to moderate the Q&A. So please address all your questions to all or to Lisa directly, and she is going to divide the questions among us or whatever she sees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. I know that there have been a couple of questions that have come up. We have one that's already in the chat area, and that is regarding intellectual property and compulsory licensing of vaccines. How are they going to relate? Are there any messages here? And I'm wondering if our colleagues that dealt with both digitalization and perhaps also roles for the public and private sector might be able to share something in that regard.
Yes, we have a message about the intellectual property right in relation with digitalization, especially big data. So whether we can claim the intellectual property right about our own things, and then how much the user should compensate for that. So those are very difficult. So it is very important for the international leaders to reach an agreement. Take time. Yeah. So efforts should accelerated. So because this will be a very important area for the further digitalization, but it will be a very big challenge. Yes. So yeah. So details can be shared later with email. Here. Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
No, I don't have anything to say.
Okay. Lisa, there is a question that I got privately here. Can I say it out loud
and
answer?
Please.
Yeah. During the pandemic situation, social mobility is severely limited. And in this situation, how could revive the economy, market, and maintain consumer demand? And let me say that social mobility is not something, it's not a policy, social mobility. It's actually an outcome of a system that is operating efficiently, all right? In everything that we said, we have the answer to your question. Immediately during the pandemic and immediately after, we are talking about support to the enterprises to be able to continue to operate. But hand in hand with this, and in parallel, we have to adopt the institutional reforms that are needed in the different countries. By so doing, okay, you will be able to revive the economy, and everything else will follow, including the consumer demand. Because most of the problems that economies face and suffer from are related to the institutional arrangements and to the lack of governance. If these are resolved, then things are going to get a lot clearer.
Thank you. We also have some questions, I believe, early on, which related to trade issues, whether it's respect to US and China, and then just generally trade agreements. I'm wondering if any members of the group would like to jump in and share some thoughts in that regard. And Abla, I don't know if there's anything else you want to share on the actual questions itself that came up last week.
Maybe Carol has just joined in. Perhaps there was a question last week about China and the existence of China and the issue, the problem between China and the US, and how do we deal with the multilateral arrangement with this in the scene and the background. Would you care to talk about that? Because this was a question that was raised last week, actually.
Yes, thank you, Abla. I'm sorry for joining late. I was just in a farewell dinner, lunch for the Japanese ambassador to the EU. So we were discussing trade issues amongst others all the time, because the EU has just concluded a very important trade agreement with Japan, the EPA. And EPA is already in its first year of functioning and is, seen to be on both sides, let's say, very promising. Of course, if you look at the multilateral dimension of trade today, it doesn't function, and it has enormous repercussions because We don't have a WTO dispute settlement settlement panel which functions just because the Americans refuse to nominate the judges in the dispute settlement panel, by which if you have a dispute in international trade, it cannot, I mean, it cannot be judged. So that's why, I mean, the bilateral trade agreements are a much more promising way forward than the multilateral way. But which we said in our piece, let's say, we cannot give up the multilateral, because without the multilateral and without a well-functioning WTO, we cannot have world trade. And that is, yeah, important for all of us, and extremely, extremely difficult in today's circumstances, let's say, that the multilateral dimension, not only in trade, but also in other domains, is not functioning.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Dr. Mahfouz Kabir, and that's kind of it's a bit of a carry-on from that as well, in terms of, you know, some of the countries were set to graduate from you know, their status and move up, and it looks like now the pandemic is a step backwards. How can international organizations help them overcome the economic hurdles? I just want to jump in briefly, and then maybe we can ask Carl to come back to that in terms of that that last working group. But that can also be an example of one of the things and that Jan had mentioned for straight up, and he's certainly also welcome to come in with respect to, for example, debt forgiveness. I think the stance of the group wasn't so much that debt forgiveness would be applied uniformly. We're certainly aware of the issues of moral hazard, but this might be an example where one can use incentives to actually build back better. So we were actually raised and had a discussion about, might we use the possibility that if countries, particularly those in the emerging world that had limited resources, were going to be able to use resources to put in major structural reforms that they needed to do and that were important for their long-term economic well-being and sustainability, that in fact they might get credits, and that could be, that some of their debt could be forgiven. So again, if you're undertaking long-term reforms, could the multilateral institutions help underwrite and secure and perhaps forgive a portion of their long-term debt, so really we're all moving forward in a sustainable manner? So I'll leave it there and see if Carl or Mark might like to jump in further.
Can I intervene?
Yes.
Can I intervene?
Please.
Yeah.
Yes, in relation with the question of debt forgiveness, I think we can make a distinction between Africa and Latin America. Probably the best solution in relation with Africa is debt forgiveness. In relation with Latin America, the suspension, temporal suspension of the debt. And I'd like to take advantage of my word, my floor now, to strongly agree with the words expressed by Jan in relation with enhanced tax collection. But in my opinion, we have to concrete that this enhanced tax collection should be addressed to big corporation, mainly digital big corporation, in order to differentiate big corporation with small and medium companies. Without more taxes to big corporation will be impossible to implement the measures and goals we have envisaged. For example, invest in human capital, in education. We need taxes in the context of enormous indebtedness now because of the COVID-19. Then, to end, I'd like to emphasize again that we have to present a fight against tax havens, which is an unacceptable situation. Tax havens should be suppressed And this is a question not envisaged by the different recommendations we have learned in the last days in this think tank conversation. And I'd like to say that I congratulate Jim McGann because of the big organization of this conversation between many think tanks all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had another question, also you can see in the chat area relating to small and medium enterprises, and in fact how some countries are using them for creating or using predatory taxes to make tactics, excuse me, to make inroads and play havoc with smaller and developing countries, and that there are these are issues certainly with respect to the WTO and how do we adjudicate some of these unfair practices. I'm wondering whether any of my colleagues on the SME side or perhaps Carl on the multilateral side might want to take some of that on.
Lisa, could you repeat the question? Because when you were posing the question, it got cut. I didn't get the entire question.
Sure. The question is, the comment in the chat is that while governments are helping out with finances and waivers, one country is using predatory tactics to make inroads and play havoc with smaller developing countries. So again, it's certain countries that are using certain tactics to then be aggressive vis-a-vis smaller countries and take a much more aggressive position in this area. So this can be something that may need to be adjudicated with the WTO, but also that it's, the question really is, what kind of support could governments offer small and medium enterprises and distressed units when they're really trying to battle both internal and external issues?
Okay, I think this has to do a lot with informality, because in developing countries, of course, like micro enterprises and smaller enterprises, of course, get it's like a cross problem with informality. I think that coming back to an issue that has to do with taxes, I think that not only in development countries we need tax relief, but also in developed countries for all types of companies, since taxing enterprises always has to do with less employment that they can offer to labor market. I don't know if maybe Abla would like to talk about informality in the sense of the question and underdeveloped countries.
Yes, let me try to answer. I add a few points to what Maria just presented. SMEs need to be heard. Their voice needs to be heard internationally. When we talk about private sector involvement in decisions taken by international organizations or international arenas, private sector means big players. The small players are not taken into consideration. So we have to work out a mechanism whereby the small players need to be in. This is one key message, especially as far as the WTO is concerned. And I think the time is right with the WTO because there's going to be a change of leadership, okay, change of leadership of the organization. And I think it is essential that the less developed countries and the small enterprises are better represented. This is one thing. Another thing, one of the best ways to support SMEs is to get them integrated into bigger value chains, whether locally or globally, okay? Because typically the small enterprises are always operating on their own at a very low level, and typically the quality of what they produce is not good for fitting in the value chain. So efforts to integrate the small enterprise into the value chains would solve what is called the missing middle problem in most developing countries. You find big companies vertically integrated, they do everything for themselves when there are things that can easily be done by the smaller players. Okay, this could happen if policies are taken in this direction. One third point is actually very relevant to developing countries, and that's often not looked at all. Okay, when countries attempt to facilitate export procedures or import procedures by way of improving the system, more often than not, they have in mind companies exporting directly or importing directly, when in reality, the small players are always dealing through intermediaries. And this is a different setup, okay? And so the advantages that they get are different. They hardly feel the impact of that. I think these are all issues that can support the SMEs in the proper way. But the direct answer to the question has to do with the proper representation of the SMEs in the international arenas. I think it's essential.
Thank you. We had an actual follow-up on that, which was also to say, why not include micro enterprises together with the SMEs in the presentation? So Abla or Maria Clara, I wonder whether you can also, maybe jump in on that, the question of micro enterprises.
Now, let me say something about that. It's very important that it is distinguished between micro and small and medium. Micro enterprises are enterprises that are there for poverty alleviation, okay, primarily. Small and medium are integrated in the economic system for the purpose of economic development. This does not mean that they are less important, but it means that they need to be handled differently, and adding them as in one package, okay, would not be correct. Having said that, perhaps adding a paragraph, okay, on the micro enterprises, okay, would be useful there, okay, but in their own right and not as part of the SMEs, because their affiliation to the economy is completely different.
Thank you. We had another question that now flips over to the digitalization area. And basically it's sort of talking about that reforms regarding technology and privacy and invasion tend to be late to the game. They're always sort of, dealt with after, and the fixes are put in. How should global leaders, international organizations, think tanks, et cetera, approach this problem? So maybe we can think about both digitalization and the multilateral and international institutions.
That's a good question. That's a big challenge. Yes, privacy invasion is a huge problem, as I said before. And then, actually, there are many approaches, and then those things are being discussed together with the problem issue of the base erosion and the profit shifting that Diego mentioned earlier. So those things are all require the international agreement, because it is impossible to have a inconsistent or incompatible system to solve this problem. Yeah. So, but its problem is currently it's very difficult to have a face-to-face contact among the global leaders. And then they are using the digital technology, but no, they are not yet accustomed to that kind of way of negotiation. That's one of the problems for making the progress slower. But yeah, so as soon as this severe situation of the coronavirus is subside, then the governments and leaders will start need to negotiate this issue. Mark, do you have any comments?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I don't have a lot of comments on these technical issues, but just in general on the issue of multilateral cooperation, I think what I've noticed is that Many people in many countries are complaining about the general rapid decline in multilateral cooperation. But I guess what I've noticed is that many countries have not really supported it enough in the past. So I think those countries which really want to see these various multilateral systems strengthened, they really need to put in more financial and political resources to them. And if not all countries want to join it, we cannot necessarily force countries to join when they don't want to, but there has to be like more of a coalition of the willing. And so the countries that are willing, then they need to put up more money to support the international organizations if they want the services, and they have to politically support them. And that those countries that do not want to participate, then they should not be enjoying the benefits of them. And I think that may happen for a while until all countries, understand more the benefits of multinational cooperation, multilateral cooperation. Thank you.
Let me add one thing. May I?
Please.
Yes. So this issue of invasion of privacy and digitalization is closely related to the bigger issue of digital currency, which will change the global economy completely. So each big countries are making strategy, especially how to deal with China's movement toward renminbi, making renminbi as a digital global currency. So yeah, so it may take time to longer time to have a international agreement, but there will be kind of smaller issues that can be tackled quickly, and then the digitalization will continue to move forward. But yeah, in the long run, eventually the world community, international community, have to solve that, or have to make decision about digital currency.
Thank you. Carl, do you have anything to add on the international collaboration side?
Carol is not here. Proceed, Luisa.
Okay, very good. We have a question in terms of job markets as well. How do we balance creating jobs at home, dealing with our own domestic economies versus the broader issues and making sure that we don't have too much protectionism as well, and creating so many barriers then to anybody else to come in. I'm wondering, we can maybe circle back to Jan, if Jan might like to take that on. We also had some questions in terms of taxation, and maybe Jan, while we're at it too, so both in terms of jobs, dealing with the local labor market versus protectionism, and then there was a second question in terms of our comments on taxes, both tax collection and then perhaps flat tax versus progressive taxes.
So as far as labor market is concerned, I think the disruption that has been so far something that never happened before. I mean, the size of the lockdown is really big, and what happened to the labor market is really going to depend on how long this lockdown and lockdown-related slowdown is going to last. But there might be some areas in the economies that would be sort of disappearing, or that would shrink in size to a large extent. So the one thing that we should really focus on is labor mobility and supporting on-the-job training, switching but improving the job switching skills in a way, supporting mobility across professions and so on and so on. And this is something that's going to be. I mean, there will be surely a lot of
restructuring in a way that the structures of the economies will change. In particular, some of the service sectors might be, in fact, shrink in size, and some of the service sectors will, on the other hand, expand. And as we said before, we think that introducing some flexibility into the labor market, in particular in the areas where when there is a choice of firing someone and maybe giving him a half of his employment, half of his job, or reduce his salary instead of firing him, is a preferred option, right? So there have been a lot of debate on that during the previous crisis in 2009, and in particular the German solutions like this Kurzarbeit schemes and so on, they proved to be quite effective. But this is something that we should consider over a short to medium run, but not over the long run. Where basically, if we will see some sectors disappearing, we don't want to keep them on life support, and we want to make sure that people move from the resources in general, move from the sectors that shrink to the sectors that expand. There was some other question on.
We had a question on the tax side. They were both in terms of tax collection, enhancing tax collection, and comments on that side. And then, of course, the debate between flat taxes and progressive taxes.
Yeah, so there is this debate about the flat tax and the progressive tax. Well, of course, this is subject to strong, so to say, country-specific preferences, and the question itself, it has some
Lisa,
it has some pretty strong statements, like that the flat tax is certainly better than a progressive tax. Well, I don't know if we're talking about the income taxes on individuals, or whether we are talking about the income taxes on enterprises. So,
Abel, do you want to jump in here? I wanted to come in as well. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but when Jan is done, are you done?
I'm almost finished. So, so as far as economic efficiency is concerned, probably the flat tax is better, but at the same time, we are aware of increasing inequality. And this increasing inequality is something that we cannot ignore. And this progressive taxation doesn't have to be there through a progressive tax rate. It can be through some other means, like tax credits, or some tax-free amounts, or some other tax deductions. But at least for me, it's important that the poorest parts of the society do not pay taxes if they cannot, afford the basic necessities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. That's important. And Abla, please feel free.
Yes, it's a very famous debate, the one between the flat tax and the progressive tax. And really, the problem is multidimensional, and it's important to see it this way. For example, the flat rate, in the case of Egypt, we applied the flat rate at a certain period of time, and it actually brought in a revenue that was higher for the government, a revenue that was higher than the progressive rate, okay? It is possible, but there are issues to look at. How broad is the tax base is important. In many countries, when they impose the progressive taxation, or when they impose higher tax rates, let's put it this way, they're imposing it on the same group that are functioning in the economy, almost killing the duck that lays the golden egg, all right? So the issue is related with how big the tax base, how good the procedures are, okay? So there is big institutional reform in the tax area. before deciding about whether it's flat or progressive. And when you talk progressive, very often you end up with, in reality, regressive taxation. You have nominal progressive taxation, but in reality, you end up with regressive taxation because of lots of tax evasion that's happening at the level of the rich countries. I think the key principle, the basic principle, is to have justice in the payment of the tax and justice in the spending of the tax. These are the two key principles that need to be held on. Okay? How does this translate into a flat or a progressive taxation, income taxation, or wealth taxation, which is actually becoming a much more urgent issue? The inequality in wealth is way higher than the inequality in income. So it's multidimensional. One cannot give a straight solution. The tax base, the level of the procedures, okay, and the fairness of the collection and the spending.
Thank you. We had another question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Maybe could I
Please
address
go ahead.
this issue? Yeah, so yeah, I'd like to address this issue of this basic issue of the relation between the taxes and innovation, but I think it's also related to jobs. And I think it's not necessarily the case that lower taxes are related to innovation, and I think that the healthcare is a good example. The private pharmaceutical companies, they tend to invest in the products that they think will make the most profit, and they do not invest in the medicines that help people, which may not be profitable. So therefore, if we need innovation, then it's going to require government help for the research, and then this will have to be supported by taxes. Another example that I mentioned is that going forward, if we're going to have more pandemics, we need to strengthen public health systems. This also does not generate profits, not a lot of profits. The contact tracers may be not very busy during the periods when we don't have a pandemic. We want to keep them on. Well, this is not really a private sector activity. The government spending creates jobs. It does not necessarily create profits. So I think going forward, when we have so many crises like this, the COVID crisis may last longer than much longer than we expect. We may have more similar COVID crises in the future. We have other crises like climate and others, and so and I think we can use deficit spending for a while, and many countries are doing this on a very large scale, but eventually if we want to pay for this spending, we may need some kind of new tax like a progressive tax or green tax. Thank you.
Thank you. We had another question actually kind of linking in some ways into some of these last questions, and that's on the global supply chains for certain equipment. So that, let's say, some countries are really dominating the supply chain for perhaps, the equipment that people need, and yet countries also need to be creating enough to make sure that there's enough equipment for themselves and for their people. How do we balance out some of these issues? And one of the things I know that came up in some of our discussions were perhaps some regional designations or other designations, right? How do we deal with what are nationally strategic and critical areas, which may involve incentives and creating some jobs domestically? And then, how do we, again, coordinating and interacting with the international groups, make sure that overall these areas are addressed internationally. Carl, I see you're here. I'm wondering whether you might relate some of these issues to some of the work that the international group and collaborating and coordinating among the global agencies may play a role here.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. The important thing is, in the current circumstances, if you speak about value change globally, you need to have global trade functioning, and you need to have global trade bodies functioning like the WTO, about which I spoke a moment ago. Of course, if we see the current environment with the WTO, which can be hardly effective, with countries invoking whatever reasons to stop international trade, which we, by the way, have seen also in an EU context, but to which the Commission has reacted, there is a problem. We have been promoting global value chains all over, but we need to have the organizations, the institutions supporting that active, and we won't have global value chains if this is not the case. And that's what I regret. If you have a dispute settlement panel which is not functioning in the WTO context, how can you have global value chains functioning? The same will apply, by the way, between the EU and the UK very soon. If there is no agreement by the end of the year between the UK and the EU, there will be much less trade in services and in goods between the EU and the UK, because we won't have a trade agreement. But on top of that, we will not have a dispute settlement system. As you know, all of you, I think, the UK will not accept the European Court of Justice as a dispute settlement entity, which is very well known for the conservatives. But that means that all kinds of organizations will be prevented from acting on the global scene or on the European scene in international trade networks, because they know there is no redress available.
Carl, while we have you on, maybe this also links into some of the recommendations that the subgroup had in terms of rethinking the G7, the G20, some of the systems, and then maybe also having a global group that really will address stability specifically with respect to dealing with the crisis and healthcare going forward.
Yeah, that's why the way something which I discussed with the Japanese ambassador just today over lunch, because of course, the Japanese are fairly strongly attached to the G7 and think the G7 has a role in addition to the G20, because between the G7, which he literally said, countries feel, the G7 countries feel they belong to more or less the same group, and they can discuss issues in common, like he said, for example, no China and Hong Kong issues. I proposed in what we submitted for this think tanks network today that the EU should try to unblock this entire debate about the global international institution by the EU saying, look, we just need to have one seat in the G7 and not go there with the European Commission, the European Council, plus the four different member states. Let us reform our seat and have a G7, which is basically in the future becoming G7 with China and India, which is kind of the large countries together, United States, Japan, probably also Canada, but India, China, let's say, just to discuss global issues, and then probably have in addition also a G20 which continues to function, just to bring kind of the larger countries or the larger trade blocs together with the globe to discuss many of these issues and to try to unblock what is not functioning internationally since about 2 to 3 years. That is our proposal, but by the EU, by trying to review its participation or review its membership of the international bodies, it could get a ball rolling and have other countries willing to reconsider their role and have a better functioning international governance system. Because one of the key things, again, which I see today as compared to 2008, in 2008, the G20 played a major role in reforming international financial regulation, the international financial architecture. We don't see this happening at the moment. Of course, there are some people which will be saying, no, it's not true. That's for the ZLPs. The international financial community has reacted. Saudi Arabia and its chair of the G20 has reacted. They adopted a clear statement in April 2020. I fail to see a kind of a same momentum in now as I saw in 2008. And what we concretely need to see is that we need to have an overall body to coordinate international health policy issues. Like we had in 2008, the Financial Stability Board to react to financial sector related architecture issues, we now need to have a body which brings together as well the WHO and the other economic policy entities like the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF, to have an adequate reaction to the economic policy related issues of this health crisis. I see the WHO reacting very much from its kind of technicians angle as health policy specialists, but they don't link like the specific health policy related issues to the overall economic policy related issues. What we have seen in this crisis, there are big economic policy dimensions to this health crisis, which are not sufficiently addressed in a coordinated fashion.
Thank you. I think I want to commend everyone here for a very robust discussion and really encourage everyone to please go to the broader report, which really offers many interesting policy recommendations along the lines that Carl has just spoken about with respect to the multilateral institutions, but really in many aspects that we were addressing. And I will now turn it back over to Carol and Abla, our co-chairs, to conclude.
Thank you, Lisa, for doing a great job with the questions. Appreciate your input, and I would like to thank everyone in our working group, especially the smaller group that worked so hard on the report. I'm very proud of being part of this initiative. I thank Jim for it, and I thank you for it, and hopefully, just like the last picture in the presentation, this is not going to be the end of it. Actually, it's the beginning of it. It's a fluid situation, and we are going to continue to keep up with it. We have to work out something, and we are going to announce it, I guess, when we work it out completely. And I also like to give very special thanks to Louisa, who helped significantly with this. I don't think we would have been able to make it if it weren't for Louisa. Thank you, Louisa, very much. Back to you, Carol, please.
I can say something. I mean, thank you, Abla. It was great cooperating with you. I mean, the totally unexpected thing of this experience was that, yeah, we were brought together from different angles. I must say, initially, I thought, how could we have overall recommendations for economies which are so widely different across the globe on an issue which affects us all? But in the end, the experience of this group has been that we can do this. And that's been, I mean, for me also personally, a very interesting experience of that. I think also for Louisa, which liked this a lot, that with, I mean, institutions which are basically globally representative, we can make recommendations on very specific issues, like on the informal economy, like on the role of SMEs, like on digital, like on the role of international institutions, I think which makes sense. And that's been, for me personally, extremely interesting. So I think it was a very useful cooperation. So I would like to thank all the members of the group. I think we made a useful contribution to this debate, and let's hope, let's say, we can continue to work together.
Thank you very much. I think our time is up, and so we thank everyone. We thank our audience that joined in. We hope we answered your questions the best we could. And we look forward to more surprises from Jim, I suppose. I'm sure something else is going to come up globally soon, sometime soon. So, I mean, so until then, thank you very much. And I want to thank also my team at ECS for doing all the work in hosting this particular session. And I thank you all.
Thank you. And also thank you to Lisa for moderating this debate.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye now.
All the best.
Bye, everyone.
Stay in touch. Bye.
Thank you.